on today's episode of The Mythic Masculine.
Well, I was, of course, not only very drawn to some of the new archaeology and the linguistics and the DNA studies, but also to some of the new theories about how living systems function, self-organizing theory, chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics. If we look at modern history from that perspective, we see that during the last 300 years of the Industrial Revolution, you begin to see patterns in what otherwise seems completely disconnected. You see that every progressive social movement has challenged the same one thing, a tradition of domination, whether it was the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule or the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over women and children, or the abolitionists, the civil rights, the Black Lives Matter movement, challenging another so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over inferior ones. I mean, the struggle for our future isn't between right and left and capitalism and socialism and east and west and north and south. It's between the partnership and domination elements in all these different cultures. And once we get that, we can just move.
What does it mean to be a man today? The toxic patterns of masculinity are being challenged, and new pathways are just beginning to rise. In the era of Me Too and biospheric uncertainty, how might we look to the old mythologies for guidance to navigate this space between stories? This podcast explores the historical, cultural, and contemporary voices that are shaping this dynamic conversation of the emerging masculinities. Greetings, dear listener. I'm your host, Ian McKenzie. My guest today is Dr. Riane Eisler, a social systems scientist, cultural historian, and author whose research, writing, and speaking has made an enormous impact on the cultural landscape. I first encountered her work through the book The Chalice and the Blade, where she first articulated her cultural transformation theory of history, which includes the lens of dominator versus partnership society. In the decades since, she's written numerous other books, including Sacred Pleasure, and most recently, Nurturing Our Humanity. Dr. Eisler is president of the Center for Partnership Studies, as well as given keynotes at the United Nations General Assembly, the U.S. Department of State, along with countless corporations and universities offering applications of the partnership model introduced in her work. In our conversation today, we cover the foundations of her cultural transformation theory, along with her own childhood experience of fleeing Nazi Germany. We look at the limitations of language that have so far prevented the depth of cultural change we urgently need, and how sharing a new mythology of partnerism may yet generate a more humane and environmentally sustainable world. A reminder that the Mythic Masculine is now on Substack. You are welcome to become a free subscriber and gain access to all public posts and episodes. If you're financially abundant, please consider becoming a paid subscriber for $5 a month. This supports me to continue the many hours of effort it takes to research and produce each episode. I don't accept advertising and rely on listeners like you to fund the show. You'll get access to exclusive posts, episode transcripts, and more. Visit themythicmasculine.com/supporter to join. And now, enjoy my conversation with Dr. Riane Eisler. Welcome, Riane, to the show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I love to begin my interviews by asking my guests to share a little of where they are in this moment, geographically, spiritually, emotionally, anything that feels true for you to share.
Well, where am I right this moment? I'm in my office, in my home on the Monterey Peninsula, which is very beautiful. My husband and I have been in isolation because of the COVID pandemic. And I, like many of us, am thinking of what this election will bring, what this next few months and the next year will bring. And I am very immersed in my work and my hopes for a better future.
Well, I'm very excited to have you on the show today. One, in the research I was doing on your biography and some of your later writings, I was deeply impressed by the range and scope of the amount of accolades and acclaim and significance of the work that you've offered over what seems like many decades now. And in particular, for me, I was really affected by I think it was your first major book, The Chalice and the Blade, where, it was recommended to me by a few friends and people that had been sort of tracking this cultural lens. And I was working at the time on a film project called Amplify Her, which was looking at the rise of the feminine, in this case through DJs and producers of electronic music. And by encountering your book and the main ideas within, it really provided a really significant shift for me to understand, both the cultural forces at work, and also even to begin to perhaps alleviate a kind of existential crisis of masculinity as ultimately synonymous with bad and terrible and all that went wrong, with humans. And so for this interview, knowing that your work has since progressed quite far, and I'd love to get there, I would love to begin with some of the main ideas of the book Chalice and the Blade, because I do feel it was such a formative piece of sort of a cultural contribution and to this regard. First, I would love to ask, what was it in your childhood and the way that you were brought up that was deeply impacted in your awakening into your life's work?
Well, I was a child refugee with my parents from the Nazis, and we really escaped by a miracle. And we managed to get to Cuba, to Havana, and there I grew up, of course, in the industrial slums, surrounded by poverty, experiencing poverty until my parents, got back on their feet again. So all of these experiences very early really led me to questions that I think many of us have asked, which is, does it have to be this way? When we humans have such an enormous capacity for really consciousness and sensitivity and caring and creativity, why has there been so much insensitivity, so much cruelty, so much destructiveness? And I eventually, through my research, that was the big question for me. And the question came down to what kind of a society will support these capacities that we have for caring, for consciousness, for creativity, or inhibit them, and instead really require the expression of the potential that we also have, of course, for insensitivity, cruelty, and destructiveness. So that meant that I eventually really had to completely depart from the way society is conventionally studied.
And it seems to have crystallized into the book with the title Chalice and the Blade. And I'd love for you to share, what do you mean when you say the chalice and the blade? Because it invokes such a mythic undertone, but it also corresponds to what feels like these societal orders that you brought new insight into.
Well, it took me a long time to write the book, 10 years of research and writing, and also took me a long time to really find that title. And of course, the chalice and the blade are symbols of power. One, the chalice, the other one, the blade being the power to dominate, to control, to take life, and the other being the power, the chalice power, the power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life. And as I write in The Chalice and the Blade, this is really not just symbolic, but it is how power is conceptualized depending to the degree to which a society falls on what I call the partnership domination social scale. In other words, it soon became very clear to me that I could not answer the questions of my childhood or any really fundamental questions about society by using the conventional social categories of right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist. For one thing, there have been oppressive, repressive, violent regimes in every one of these social categories. So none of them answers the question of what society should we really build. Moreover, and this was really a series of aha moments for me in my life. All these social categories, these conventional categories, like conventional studies of society, either marginalize or ignore the majority of humanity, women and children. And in The Chalice and the Blade, I told the history of our cultural evolution from what we might call a gender holistic perspective, which doesn't marginalize or ignore the female half, the female form of our species. And what the book showed is basically, in a nutshell, that the story that we've been told, the caveman cartoon, right? He's got a weapon in one hand, a club, with the other one he's dragging a woman by the hair. So what does it tell us before our brains, much less our critical faculties, are formed? That too bad, but that's just human nature. That's how it's always been, and by implication, how it always must and will be. And that is totally false. And the book really, people, including you, told me that it's even more timely now than it was when it came out 30 years ago. And as a matter of fact, if people get the book, I would urge you, get the latest printing, which is, I think, the 57th US printing, because I wrote for the 30th anniversary a new epilogue, which brings it up to date.
One of the things I appreciated about it was it really expanded what felt like an intractable conundrum, which is oftentimes when the words like patriarchy are brought out today, they're sort of seen as this inherent challenge of the rule of men, right? That men maybe inherently have this bias towards this way of hierarchy and domination, and that essentially the way forward is to get men to either surrender, this kind of inherent toxicity, right, within their system and their conditioning, or install women in the seats of power, as if that will inherently change the system. And I think that that's starting to show it's not the case, actually, that, you can put a woman in a position of power, but if the system doesn't change, then not much really changes. And so, I really appreciated in your book that you expanded upon that capacity to actually see differently. And you spoke a little bit about it already, this labels of dominator versus partnership model, which I thought was very profound. I would love for you to share just a little too about the historical context about, how this came in, because I think also one of the spells of modernity, right, is that things have always been this way, and or they were just inevitable, and what are you going to do about it? But in the book you do track some of the like very specific sort of sweeping historical shifts that happened. I mean, I'm thinking particularly around the wave of invasions that impacted the Neolithic peoples that seemed to be much more based on the partnership model. So again, I know this is a vast territory, but I'd love for you to paint a little bit for the listener that again may have very little knowledge of that it's actually trackable on the historical record.
Well, my work really looks at human cultural evolution from the perspective of the tension between, on one end, the domination system, which has a particular configuration in which, yes, gender plays a major part, the social construction of gender roles and relations, or the partnership system, again, a particular configuration. So you're quite right. This really has nothing to do with anything inherent in women or in men. What we have to understand is it really is a question of how do we socialize both women and men, and what values do we attribute to being a real man and, quote, being really feminine. And of course, we've inherited a lot of stories. Well, first of all, stories about human nature, whether it's original sin or selfish genes, it's the same story. I mean, they fight each other, but why? It's the same story. We're bad. There's something wrong with us. So we have to be really rigidly controlled from the top. Then there is a story about women and men. And I don't know, I suddenly woke up to realize, along with thousands of other women, during the 1960s, late 1960s, that as much as having been born Jewish had almost cost me my life, having been born female had had a tremendous impact on my life options. And I realized that in all my years of so-called higher education, there had been hardly anything by, about, or for people like me, women. And that was a wow for me. But, it really makes sense, doesn't it? Because as David, the historian of science, David Noble, wrote in his book aptly titled A World Without Women, and I would also say it was a world without children. Modern science came out of a clerical, a misogynist, celibate, all-male culture. And it was only 50 years ago that we even had anything like women's studies and then men's studies and gender studies and queer studies, and they're still marginalized in the siloed system of our universities. So my approach was completely different. I drew from a much larger database. And I won't go into all of the sources because they were totally multidisciplinary. But I not only drew from a database that includes the whole of our species, both the female and male form and everybody in between, but also where we all live, not just politics and economics as conventionally defined, which is the focus of sociology, political science, economics, and so on, but where we all live in our family and other intimate relations. And then, of course, the whole of our history, including that long span that we call prehistory, millennia. And I wrote the Chalice and the Blade at a time when a lot of this knowledge was just beginning to bubble up. And it was very exciting because archaeology, the study of mythology, and of course today linguistics, DNA studies, all show that actually the original direction of our cultural evolution for millennia until about 5 to 10,000 years ago, was primarily in a partnership direction. And then there came this shift, many theories about why, but it came. And to me, what I've really been dealing with more and more is that we've been trying to really go back, not to any quote good old days, but to the partnership configuration in the last several hundred years during the disequilibrium of the Industrial Revolution, now accelerating during the real dislocations of, well, the post-industrial revolution, COVID-19, the climate change. I mean, a lot is basically saying, hey, we better change or else.
It makes me think of how this current collective crisis really feels like the consequence of a dominator system.
It definitely is. I mean, because at a certain level of technological development, including the tremendous rise in population, that modern medicine, which is a good technological development, but without family planning, it's been a disaster. You know, between these tremendously powerful technologies of industrialization and the population explosion, the domination system really is reaching its logical end in terms of finite resources on this planet. And then there's much more than that, of course, because we have now the weaponry, you know, the technologies of destruction that we only used to attribute to an all-powerful male deity, right? Mm-hmm. You know, well, we've got them. Biological warfare, nuclear warfare. So if technology is guided by an ethos of domination, we have really, again, had it as a species.
I so appreciate that as well, because it does open up almost like a completely other way of thinking about what is technology, because it feels like you say, if technology is put in service of a dominator system, then how we perceive technology, or how we perceive these great, you know, quote, advances and their impacts, it only seems in that direction, right? Like even the ones that say, whoa, you know, technology is inherently bad. But then I start to wonder again, like what would technology be like if it was put in service of a partnership model, right? A partnership culture. What would it, you know, what kinds of things would be create? Like social media, for example, could be completely different if it was actually geared towards building connection and relationship instead of sort of extracting attention, you know, for economic gains and things like that.
Well, I think that in my later books, I actually address that issue in my book on economics, The Real Wealth of Nations, subtitled Creating a Caring Economics of Partnerism, actually. This is where I introduce what is now becoming a campaign, Make Partnerism Mainstream. I deal with this issue of technology. I recently gave the keynote virtually, actually, to the conference of AI, Artificial Intelligence for Good.
Wow.
And of course, the point I made is that really the whole issue isn't the artificial intelligence, it's how is it programmed. And that in turn really depends on whether we orient to a partnership or a domination system. And also, and this is vital, because we've inherited a gendered system of values in which anything that in domination systems is stereotypically associated with real masculinity, you know, domination, conquest, the notion that a real man is characterized by not being like a woman, which means he's not going to be soft, he's not going to be caring, he's not going to do caregiving, all the things that so many men are today rejecting, by the way, and saying, wait a minute, I mean, caring is human. Of course it is. But But the point of it is that that gendered system of values has really affected our social and fiscal and economic priorities. So consider there's always enough money for prisons, right? And what's that? That's the sort of archetype that we've inherited of the punitive male head of households. Very appropriate for domination systems. Always enough money for weapons, for wars. Another domination archetype, the hero as warrior, as killer, but somehow we don't have enough money for the quote soft, the feminine, like health care, child care, paid parental leave, support for parents, education for parents. I mean, it's crazy. And going back to the Chalice and the Blade, if you remember, I have some chapters, 2 chapters in the book called Reality Stood on Its Head, which was a remissing process. And so I think of my work now as a really standing reality right side up.
Beautiful. You know, I realize with the listener too, they may have different understandings even of what they understand dominator or partnership to be. And I would love for you to just illuminate perhaps more clearly some of the characteristics of either, so they can have a sense now of exactly what we mean when we say these terms.
Well, the method I used is called the study of relational dynamics. And of course, one thing it addresses is what kinds of relationships does a particular social system support or inhibit. But also, it addresses the question of how do the major elements of a system, the critical elements, relate to one another and support one another. And I say that as a preface because we're so used to thinking of just linear causes and effects. But with living systems, we're learning, and societies, like the human body, like the human being, we're complex systems, and you have to really think more of interconnections and mutually supporting relationships. So we're talking about configurations. And these are, as I said, 2 poles, and real societies orient to one or to the other. We see it in the United States today, we see both elements. But let me answer your question, if I may. In the domination system, first of all, you have an authoritarian, top-down system of relations in both the family and the state or tribe. Whereas in the partnership system, and that's the first element of both systems, in the partnership system, you have more equality, more democracy in both the family and the state or tribe. And as you can tell, one of the things that distinguishes this approach is that it's holistic. The second thing relates to gender. And it's very interesting because in domination systems, domination-oriented societies, you see this universally, whether it's in Hitler's Nazi Germany, in Stalin's former Soviet Union, rightist, leftist, whether it's religious, because these are secular, Khomeini's Iran, ISIS, the Taliban, or the rightist fundamentalist alliance in the West. The rigid ranking of one form of human over the other form, men over women. Whereas in the partnership side, you have more gender partnership. And what happens really is what I mentioned before, the values, the governing values of the society are directly impacted by this, because men no longer define their, quote, masculinity as not being like the soft, feminine, caring, caregiving, nonviolence. Those are not for real men. The third element, and these are all interconnected and mutually supportive, is the degree of abuse and violence. To maintain these top-down rankings, whether it's man over man, man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, you name it, you really have to have socially accepted, built-in abuse and violence, all the way from child and wife beating to warfare, to pogroms, to lynchings. You move to the partnership side, of course there's some violence in partnership-oriented societies, but it's not built into the system. It's not needed to maintain these rigid rankings. And the fourth element relates really to story and to language. You know, in the domination system, as we are beginning to untangle, and as my work really incisively dissects, I would say, we are told stories that not only justify, but actually idealize domination systems and make them seem inevitable, just human nature. Whereas in the partnership system, we recognize that we have, these capacities for violence, for cruelty, for destructiveness, but they're not the ideal norm. It's a crazy system when you really look at the domination system. But, if you fast forward, for example, when Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, there was a study at that time that a lot of the Trump supporters were very much into controlling and spanking and punishing their children. And there was another study that said that one of the things that they had in common was this terrible hostility and fear of so-called uppity women. It's almost textbook. My latest book, which just came out with Oxford University Press last year in 2019, co-authored by anthropologist Douglas Fry. That book has a lot of studies really showing what happens with our brains. The subtitle is How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future.
Wow. You bring up something really interesting to me too, which is, I have experience is in another community in Portugal, actually called Tamera, of which I've spent a few years making a film about their alternative culture, which I would say very much is an exploration into partnership society. And what they said one time was how these inner structures that we carry within being raised in a dominator system, it's almost like you can't just put somebody raised in a dominator system in a partnership system and they suddenly click and they get it. It's actually there's almost like a sway of needing to have a structured dominating system because in some ways it feels safer, right? And I see the core.
It's familiar.
Exactly.
It's familiar.
So there's like a parallel, it feels like, between even like one's own family, if there was a dominator structure, with a kind of authoritarian parent that sort of had it in charge, even if there was fear of violence.
We're going to vote for strongman rule, whether it's here, whether it was in Egypt, where they voted in a totally authoritarian, religious regime. It was tragic. Mm-hmm. It is tragic, but as you say, it feels safer, especially in times of rapid change.
And so what do you think is the inner work that people need to do in some sense to correspond with the cultural frame, because it strikes me that is a parallel endeavor, that's needed to, in a way, clear the inner structures to be able to work in partnership?
Well, I think the good news is that we can change all through life, but it's hard. It is really hard. And studies actually from neuroscience show that the part of the brain that makes us able to adjust to change, the famous study years ago was of a dog slowly turning into a cat. People who were of this rigid domination authoritarian type had a heck of a time seeing the cat. And then more recently, as one of the studies actually in Nurturing Our Humanity in my latest book is by a neuroscientist and his team studying the brain structure of these people. And yeah, the part of the brain that makes it possible for us to shift, to come out of it, they can't. They have a terrible time. So you can understand climate change denial. But the thing is that they do respond to the authority figure. And if, for example, we could by a miracle get some of the people who now respond to, say, some evangelical leaders who say, Trump was sent by God, he's flawed and whatever, and say we were, but it's not likely that they're going to do that is the problem. So we have a real problem with a good part of the population, but not everybody raised in these kinds of families reacts this way. That also is the good way, so that a certain percentage can shift. And for the rest of us, there are so many people today, and the so-called crisis of masculinity isn't really a crisis of masculinity any more than women redefining femininity was a crisis of femininity. It's really a social awakening, waking up from the domination trance. And from all of these archetypes, whether it was Jung with the anima and the animus, oh my gosh, I mean, talk about built-in sexism. It's fantastic. Or the mythologies that we're taught about, real men have to kill before they get to mate. I mean, we're surrounded by this stuff. But the good news, again, is we can change the myths. And so many younger, mostly, but also older people like me are changing the story. And we humans live by story.
That's powerfully said. In the book, you reference how this time mirrors the end of the Roman Empire in some ways, of a kind of, chaotic, liminal space where the possibility of a Gaelic, if I'm saying that correctly, the Gaelic resurgence has a possible ability to assert itself more fully, or to pollinate, a wider. And you use this phrasing around like attractors, or like the role of attractors in liminal times. And I'd love for you to sketch that out a bit for the listener, because I found it so helpful.
Well, I was, of course, not only very drawn to some of the new archaeology and the linguistics and the DNA studies, but also to some of the new theories about how living systems function, self-organizing theory, chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics. And I borrowed the term attractor, and thinking of the partnership model and the domination or dominator model as two attractors. Now, I think that if we look at modern history from that perspective, we see that during the last 300 years of the Industrial Revolution, really, if you look at modern history, again, you begin to see patterns in what otherwise seems completely disconnected. You see that every progressive social movement has challenged the same one thing, a tradition of domination, whether it was the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule, or the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over women and children, or the abolitionists, the civil rights, the Black Lives Matter movement, challenging another so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over inferior ones. The movements for really social and economic equity, the movements against violence, including the most recent movement, which is very important, challenging this pandemic of violence that we're just finally documenting against women and children globally. And that is really important, all the way to the environmental movement, challenging our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature, right? But if you look at these movements, they focus primarily on dismantling what I call the top of the domination pyramid. Politics and economics is conventionally defined. And they've left the foundations on which this domination system keeps rebuilding itself, whether it was in Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union or Khomeini's Iran or the Taliban or ISIS or, right here in the United States, the Rightist Fundamentalist Alliance, which is really what do children learn? So childhood is one cornerstone. Gender, as I mentioned, we have inherited a gendered system of values. Economics, our economic systems are really shaped by this gendered system of values, both capitalism and socialism, and which is why we at the Center for Partnership Studies developed new metrics to show the economic contribution value of the work of caring for people, starting in childhood, and caring for nature, and of course, story and language. If we don't work together, yes, we need to do the short-term work. It's crazy to have funding for, and really, giveaways to fossil fuel companies. But we also need to join together to rebuild these cornerstones, shift them from domination to the partnership side. And that is what this work is really about now for me. And that's what the Make Partnerism mainstream campaign is all about.
In the book, you also mentioned that, and again, I know this is 30 years ago now, but you spoke to feminism as like a primary force for this correction of dominator to partnership. And I just appreciated the lens there too, because I think that, a lot of contemporary ways of speaking about feminism are often portraying it as, inherently man-hating or something like that, right? And in some ways, I'm feeling like, oh, it's interesting, like the dominator system would portray it that way, right? Because in that way, it actually makes it sort of less viable for the general populace to take it up, right? Because those will say, well, I hear a lot of women say this, right? They're like, well, I guess I'm not a feminist because I don't hate men, right? And so they kind of refuse to step into that active participation. But the way that you characterize it is that it's fundamentally opposes the dominator system, which actually is a much more compelling, I think, invitation for both men and women and others to participate based on that. And I wonder, now 30 years on too, do you feel that feminism has sort of gone down certain paths that maybe weren't as helpful, or do you feel it's as robust in contemporary culture now as it's ever been?
There are many feminisms.
Sure.
And there are some women who have been so hurt in their relations with men who have embraced and acted out the domination archetype, stereotype, that, they probably have an enormous amount of anger against men. But, and certainly there is anger against injustice and against being ignored and silenced. That's part of feminism. But the question is recognition. See, I don't talk about patriarchy and matriarchy. For one thing, think about it for a minute. This is the language that we're provided for a gender-specific category. Either men rule or women rule. So it's really just two sides of the domination coin, isn't it? There is no partnership alternative. So I think that feminism, in the sense of empowering both women and men to change these stereotypes which really limit and distort the humanity of both women and men. That is at the bottom what it's about. How it's going to be interpreted by people who have been really hurt and damaged by their life experiences with domination and oppression. Hey, mm-hmm. I mean, that's going to be there too. But I don't use the term, I'm a feminist, in the sense that I obviously believe, look, if you look at Sweden, Finland, Norway, which have more caring policies, they also have half of their national legislature is female. And I look at it more in terms of dynamics. As the status of women rises, men no longer find it such a threat to their status, to their, quote, masculinity, to also embrace more feminine, stereotypically feminine values. So men voted for universal health care, for good quality child care, for very generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers. This is not a question of, I mean, it's not a question of feminism. It's really a question to me of a partnership alternative. And going back to the Chalice and the Blade, which was the first book, as you said, for a popular audience, describing my findings, we are really not talking about a matriarchy here. We're talking about more partnership-oriented cultures. But in the dominator mind, there are only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. Mr. Trump said it. It's all about domination. Poor man, he doesn't see that there is a viable and much more effective partnership alternative.
Thank you for that. The book you followed Chalice and the Blade with, I believe, was the one on sacred sexuality. That's correct?
It's called Sacred Pleasure. The subtitle is Sex, Myth, and the Politics of the Body. And it prefigures a lot of my later writing, because the first part, in Spanish, it's been published in 2 volumes, because the first part is really about what happened to rip sexuality and spirituality asunder. Because we still see traces of that. If you think about candles, music, flowers, wine, it's about sex, about romance, but it's also about our most sacred rites. And the word passion, we use it for romantic, sexual love, but also for the mystical experience of religion. So the traces are still there. So what happened? What happened to the sacred marriage, the sacred union of female and male? Well, I mean, a lot happened to it, and that's what the first part of the book is really about. The second part is about now. And just as with Chalice, it is so relevant still today. And it makes a point that I'd like to reiterate, that a lot of what happened with the so-called sexual revolution really was not a revolution. It was giving women permission to embrace the so-called masculine hookup role, in sexual relations, to the terrible dissatisfaction of women, certainly, but also of men. With no ethic. I mean, in Sacred Pleasure, I actually propose an ethic for sexual relations, not necessarily for long-term relations, but an ethic. Why do we say all's fair in love and war? That's crazy.
Wow. I would love to know a little of that ethic, actually. I'm really intrigued by that.
Well, you read the book.
It's on order. The other piece that comes to me with this is, I mentioned prior my film project, Amplify Her, which I co-directed with a female director, and it was largely expanded upon into a graphic novel series, a motion comic, with many other female creatives, and it also featured women creatives, DJs and producers. But the through line for that, for me, was really trying to empower or make visible this sort of erotic creative vitality that these women were expressing. And it was fascinating to watch, again, like, how it was received by certain communities, right? Certain folk, certain film festivals, right? Because some looked at that and they said, oh, well, that's one, it's still this kind of hangover of sexuality is sort of, impure or lesser than, or, just like the carnal was denigrated in some sense, that it was sort of, lesser than. And then the others that would say, well, this is actually going backwards for feminism, they were saying. Like the ability to actually embrace that there was something specific and unique about the erotic vitality and creativity of the feminine, felt for some that it was going backwards, right? Is this like, what do you mean? Actually we're all the same. And so any differentiation is just conditioning and it's holding us back and da-da-da. And so I hear in what you're saying though, that there is this like primal creative force that is significant. And for me, I guess I'm curious, is so much of what is necessary to actually, create this partnership balance. Because like I said, if without those things, then it's just the same male system. It just happens to be occupied by women.
And I think that what has been one of the problems. You still have this male, or rather not male, the quote masculine, as defined in domination systems, as the norm. And when I speak now, of course, I talk about the COVID pandemic as not going back to quote normal. Normal, where in this wealthy United States, 1/4 of all children lived in poverty, where we're destroying our natural life support systems. It's about creating a new normal, new norms, and stories, archetypes informed now by the consciousness of the partnership alternative, and that there's going to be a lot of experimentation in getting there. See, in the 60s, I remember so well, we mistook rebellion for reconstruction.
Wow.
And let's not make the mistake this time. I mean, resistance is important, but we need to reconstruct the system. And for that, we need to understand the configuration of the partnership system. And so if the erotic in women and that creative energy is to be valued, then you have to be careful that it isn't really perceived as just, this is enough. It isn't enough. For that to work, men also really have to redefine what it means to be a quote real man, which fortunately so many men today are diapering babies, feeding babies. They're getting endorphins, neurochemicals of pleasure through the grace of evolution for doing this. But I think that it's just as much men waking from the domination trance. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens. I'm rooting for us to move towards partnership archetypes and partnership myths, and I'm counting on people like you.
Would you share, if you do have some mythologies that do speak to this, the partnership model? As you say, stories are so vitally important in order to almost provide the like mimetic scaffolding for this energy to flow.
Well, I can think of it in terms of deconstruction and reconstruction. As you know, in both the Chalice and the Blade, well, you don't know because you haven't read Sacred Pleasure yet, but I deconstruct the Adam and Eve story, Fall from Paradise. When I was a kid, I always wanted to know, it says in the Bible, henceforth. woman was to be subordinate to men. And I wanted to know, well, what was it like before the henceforth? Nobody wanted to talk about it. I also wanted to know, why would a woman take advice from a snake? We don't usually do that. Well, in terms of the old reality, it made a lot of sense, because the snake, as you see in the so-called goddess or priestess figures from Minoan Crete, with high priestesses in the trance with snakes coiled around their arms, or as you even read about later about the Oracle of Delphi. Who was it? It was a pythoness who worked with a python, a snake, for oracular wisdom. So the snake, among other things, was a symbol of oracular wisdom. So for Eve to ask advice from a snake made a lot of sense in terms of the old reality. But then came the new domination, remything elements. All of a sudden, seeking knowledge independently becomes a high crime, right? And she is blamed for all of like Pandora, right? It's not the only myth, blaming woman. And just think of what that does, because every man is born of woman. So if you can't trust your mother, whom can you trust? So then you get these schizophrenic archetypes like Jung does, I mean, the virgin and the whore, right?
Wow.
I mean, the whole thing is nuts. But new stories. Well, there are new stories, new fairy tales, in which poor Sleeping Beauty, in the old fairy tale, she can't even wake up without a guy kissing her, right? I mean, she's so learned powerless here that kids learn. Well, you are beginning to have fairy tales. Yeah, they still look like the same old heroine, but Disney has moved a little, just a little bit, towards the empowerment of the heroine in these stories. We need to move a lot more, all kinds of body types, not, the male gaze and what is this week considered to be, in our particular culture, female attractiveness. And so there is a movement, but we've got to accelerate this. And there are so many stories now coming out of the male hero as somebody who cares. I mean, Bono is a life example. I don't know about his private life, but publicly, here's a guy who has really done good and modeled a caring masculinity. Little by little, but what we need is a mass movement. I would like to see artists and filmmakers and video makers and, just get together and brainstorm this and say, I would be very happy to consult to such a group. Wow. It's just so important that we be really focused now on telling stories that can help us heal, that can help us really remiss, so that we can move more towards the partnership side. And it is a question. I mean, you've got a 2-year-old son. Hey, we're talking about their future, and do they have one? It's up to us.
Thank you. What comes to me as I look out actually at pop culture is certainly there are some encouraging examples, I feel, of different kinds of storytelling, different kinds of conflicts, being set up. And I see, I was literally browsing on the options, the other day, trying to watch a different TV series, and I tried a few, but I actually couldn't watch them after a certain point because of the level of violence and conflict that was just so rampant. And so for me, I was struck by, even if I'm trying to find examples of, maybe I'll call them partnership-based narratives, like I don't even know what that would look like, right? I don't even know how many narrative writers even can conceive of narrative structures that are outside of a dominator model. And so it's such an interesting challenge, because like you say, we need to be telling stories with that particular lens. And it's so fascinating to even watch how hard it is to even imagine something outside of the dominator structures in which so many of us grew up.
Well, I'd love to see a series based on some of them, what we can reconstruct of the mythology of these earlier and more partnership-oriented societies, in which really, first of all, the natural and the spiritual was not separated. I mean, we call it animism, but that's not quite right, because they had a system, what looks like a system. I mean, everything is interpretation here, but the signs are so clear if you look at the art of birth and death and regeneration, with sex being the medium for both. So you have sexual rights as part of the sacred. I mean, that would be very interesting, wouldn't it? To have a series based on that mythology, which apparently still survived in the so-called high civilization of Minoan Crete. And in Sacred Pleasure, you'll see that I do a deconstruction of the Theseus and the Minotaur myth.
Wow.
Because the Minotaur is really the old bull god, but he's now demonized like the Christian devil, horned and hoofed. But now he's the product of this not sacred marriage between, like, Inanna and Dumuzi, whom she calls her bull, her sacred bull. It's just totally remissed, and Sacred Pleasure would be a fabulous source for scripts.
Wow.
For a series like that.
Well, if Netflix is listening, then get on it. What made me think of the bull as well, and starting to recognize, different symbology popping up in culture, is one of my previous films was called Occupy Love, which was directed by Velcro Ripper, and it was co-produced by myself and Nova Emmy. And that really looked at the first year of the Occupy movement, from New York onward. But what was fascinating was one of the main posters that came out, I believe it was Adbusters magazine, that sort of kicked off the invitation, at least. If you recall, was a bull, like the Wall Street bull, but with a ballerina perched on top of the bull, with like riot police kind of just in the background, behind. But the ballerina is just poised, so beautifully. And when I saw that image, and possibly even when I read Here Later, I really invoked that sense of Crete. And I understand that they would ride bulls, right, as sort of their feats of...
They had bull dancing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, bull
both
dancing.
Women and men did bull leaping. And it's been reproduced. I mean, it requires, of course, raising the bull to be not a wild bull, but more or less, as much as you can, domesticate a bull. It's been reproduced. It's an art, the bull leaping, and women and men participated in it. It was a fascinating culture that survived, while so many of the adjacent cultures already were shifting heavily towards domination. And eventually it fell, of course, to the Mycenaeans. And then you get the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur.
Yeah, and the hero reasserts as the idolization.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, the whole idea of what is heroic, what is manly, becomes very different, doesn't it? And what is feminine.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I know there's a lot more to go into with your later work, and I would love to ask a little bit about, how did then your understandings from Chalice and the Blade and beyond begin to crystallize, into the edge of where you are now, in terms of where you see are the most compelling and necessary places to focus and to create change?
Well, in Chalice, I really was trying to answer the question of how did we get here. But the book does end with two scenarios, the partnership or the domination scenario. And it does go into some of modern history. And then in Sacred Pleasure, of course, it was funny because that wasn't the book I was going to write, but it was just compelling to be written. I mean, I just had to write it. And there I really looked at how sexuality and spirituality, and with them pain and pleasure, which is one of the running themes, because domination systems are really basically held together by fear of pain or pain. Whereas there can be more sharing of pleasure, sexual and otherwise, in partnership systems. But already in that book, I started to look at, where to really elaborate on what do we need to do. So then I wrote a book on education called Tomorrow's Children. And it really, speaking of stories, now you might find stories in there that are of interest because, curriculum is a story. And unfortunately, most of so-called progressive education has focused only on process, to some extent on structure, but not enough on content, on story. And this book really focuses on that. And, and then I wrote a book that was my version of a how-to book, The Power of Partnership, which, by the way, is used in courses because it ends with practical, to-dos. I mean, to do now and to do later and so on. And then I wrote my book on economics, the real wealth of nations. In between, I wrote a book on healthcare with a former PhD student of mine, which won a couple of awards, by the way. Wow. And then I wrote Nurturing Our Humanity. I worked on that book for 10 years, and then about 7 years into it, I invited Douglas Fry to join me, not only because he's probably one of the world authorities on foraging societies, and that's how we lived for millennia, millions of years, and he calls them the original partnership societies. Wow. I mean, so this is part of the human psyche, by the way. But that book wasn't only about the four cornerstones that I mentioned of childhood, gender, economics, but a different economics, and story and language. It was also about going deeper to what we're learning from neuroscience. And what we're learning from neuroscience completely contradicts the old story about old human nature. If anything, we are wired. The pleasure centers in our brains in studies light up more when we share and care than when we win. But because our brains, and hence how we feel, think, and act, including how we vote, they really develop in interaction with our early environments, because we have such a flexible brain. And that brain structure is laid in the first 5 years. So much depends on the degree to which we orient to the partnership or domination side, which in turn is where the four cornerstones of childhood, gender, economics, but as I said, a caring economics of partnerism, and story and language come in. And that is where I am right now, to really make partnerism mainstream, because it can be so liberating and so empowering. And so much of what is happening, I mean, the struggle for our future isn't between right and left and capitalism and socialism and East and West and North and South. It's between the partnership and domination elements in all these different cultures. And once we get that, we can just move. And that's what this is about.
Wow. I just want to say how much I appreciate that articulation. And then also, yeah, what I feel is there's such a power of story in what's possible. You know, that partnerism is possible. Like just that alone is completely invigorating, you know, in a sense that otherwise, because the dominant culture provides so little alternatives that are meaningful, right? And I think a lot of people who wake up to this and they recognize, wait, there's actually nothing else proposed, end up falling into depression or numbing out or anger and all the rest, because it feels like there's nowhere to go. And I really appreciate that you've offered such a clear articulation and pathway into what's possible for our future.
Well, that's what this is all about, because you wouldn't build a house without building solid foundations for it. And it's rebellion is not enough. We really have to reconstruct, and for that we need this blueprint of what we have to build, so that we don't keep having these regressions. You know, and they're getting more and more dangerous all the time. So enough. Let's do it.
Well, that's a fitting place to end then for now. Riane, I feel very grateful for your time today and to hear a little bit about your extensive work and your dedication over so many decades to putting this forth and into the world. So on behalf of myself and all the listeners, really, really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you, Ian. Thank you. And I'm counting on you for the stories and language, because we need new language. The old language keeps us trapped. You know, and I really would like to end on that. Linguistic psychologists have long told us something that we should pay attention to, that the categories, and this is especially true of social categories, provided by our language channel our thinking. So it's almost impossible to see alternatives.
Wow.
So that's why this language of the partnership system and the domination system, partnerism, that's so important.
Wow. Well, I'll do my best.
Okay.
Thanks, Riane.
Well, my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Mythic Masculine. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing this episode on your social media. You're also welcome to join The Mythic Masculine on Substack to get all episodes in your inbox, as well as special essays, and become a paid subscriber. And finally, check out themythicmasculine.com for upcoming in-person events, ritual weekends, online courses, and more.